Hey, crew. Okay, so we're going to finish up chapter 6. We're going to see what Ribsy does now. Joe was told to get rid of Ribsy. His mom and dad dad didn't really care, but mom didn't really want him. He was going to be too expensive. And so Joe went to school. Ribsy followed him, and now Ribsy is sitting outside school as Joe walks out, and it said that Ribsy started to follow him home. And it says, Joe seemed pleased to have Ribsy at his heels, but before he opened the back door to his house, he whispered, "Come on in, let's see what happens." Ribsy followed Joe into the kitchen where Mrs. Sailor, Joe's mom, was ironing. "Junior, tuck your shirt tail in. Is that dog still here?" she demanded. This time Joe tucked his shirt tail in. "I guess he likes it here." "Don't you think he belongs to someone?" asked Mrs. Sailor. "He sure didn't act like it when he started following me around in the stadium," said Joe. Ribsy wagged his tail. Mrs. Sailor had not sounded as cross as she had the day before when she was worn out trying to get Darlene to practice. "How do you expect to feed a dog?" Mrs. Sailor wanted to know. "He's only a medium-sized dog," Joe pointed out, "and I found 21 cents in the stadium after the football game." 21 cents? How far do you think 21 cents will go these days? His mother asked. "It ought to buy 1 can of dog food." Mrs. Sailor shook her head and sighed, but she did not order Ribsy out of the house. "Are we going to get to keep him?" asked Darlene when she came home from school a few minutes later and found Ribsy in the kitchen. "Ask your father," answered her mother. "Now wash your hands and practice your piano lesson." That evening, Ribsy was served a supper of beets, cold leftover macaroni and cheese, and a crust of bread and margarine that Darlene had refused to eat, even if eating crust was supposed to make her hair curly. Ribsy, who was not a choosy dog, had eaten meals that he had enjoyed more. After supper, he slipped into the living room and curled up on the carpet. Excuse me. He might as well assume he was welcome until someone told him he was not. Mr. Sailor settled back in his favorite chair, the one with the sagging springs, to read the evening paper while Mrs. Sailor occupied herself pasting her blue chip stamps in a little book. Mr. Sailor was in a good humor because he had found the belt of his customer's dress that day. Joe sat down on the floor in front of the television set to watch a detective program. Darlene chose that moment to practice the Pussycat Waltz. "Dad, make her stop," said Joe. "She hasn't practiced all day, and the minute I want to look at TV, she has to start banging." "I am not banging," said Darlene, and added, "Your old program bothers me when I'm practicing." Plink, plunk, plunk. She made a great show of sitting up straight and holding her wrists up properly while she played. "You're just trying to be a pest," Joe informed her, "and to get out of doing your homework." Plink, plunk, plunk. "Dad, Junie's bothering me when I'm trying to practice." Darlene knew it especially annoyed her brother to be called Junie. "Cut it out, you kids." Mr. Sailor was paying very little attention to his children. He was used to bickering. "Psst," hissed Joe. Gunfire rattled from the television. "You're the pest," said Darlene without missing a beat. "Won't let me practice in peace." "Ha," said her brother. Darlene didn't fool him 1 minute. Ribsy didn't care for the piano playing, but he did not mind the bickering. He had heard the boys and girls in his neighborhood talk in the same tone of voice many times. Suddenly, Mr. Sailor looked up from his paper. "Well, what do you know?" he said. "That mutt you picked up has his picture in the paper, right here in the sports section." "Hey, let me see." Joe leaped to his feet and peered over his father's shoulder. There was his dog, photographed at the moment he tripped the football player. It was all in the picture. The running dog, the falling player, the rolling ball. By now, Mr. Sailor was reading the story under the picture. "It says the dog belongs to Joe Sailor and gives our address." "Did you tell him that, Junior?" "Sort of, I guess," admitted Joe. Mr. Sailor read on. "Beats me the way newspapers can get things mixed up. It says here the dog's name is Junior." He laughed. "Ha! A dog named Junior. That's a good one." "Yeah." Joe laughed too, less heartily. He felt embarrassed to be found out, but at the same time he was pleased. He could cut out the picture and take it to school to show everyone how important his dog was. That is, he could if his mother let him keep the dog. This was a question he was carefully avoiding. The longer the dog was allowed to hang around, the better his chances of keeping him. So far, things looked hopeful. Mrs. Sailor finished fitting a row of blue chip stamps onto a page of the little book before she came to look over her husband's shoulder along with Darlene. "Oh, that dog," was all she said. Joe stooped to pet the dog he was now sure belonged to him. It was so right there in the newspaper. It said so right there in the newspaper. That ought to convince his family. Ribsy looked up gratefully and thumped his tail on the floor. Then the telephone rang. "I'll get it!" shrieked Darlene, who always liked to get the telephone first. "It's for you, Dad," she said, disappointed. "Who is it?" her father asked. "I don't know. Some boy asked for Joe Sailor." Some boy, huh? Mr. Sailor sank back in his chair. "You get it, Junior. It's probably some kid from school." "Oh, that's right," said Darlene. "Some people do call Junie Joe. I forgot." Joe tried to trip his sister on the way to the hall to answer the telephone. "Hello?" he said. "Hello," answered a strange boy's voice. Joe Sailor?" "Yes." "Well, my name is Henry Huggins," said the boy. "Your dog, how long have you had him?" "A while," said Joe cautiously. "Why?" "He's my dog," said Henry. "I lost him at the shopping center about a month ago." "Who is it, Junior?" asked Mrs. Sailor. "A boy," Joe told his mother, and the answer seemed to satisfy her. "The shopping center," repeated Joe into the telephone, hoping to gain time to think. "That's way on the other side of town." "I know," admitted Henry, "but my dog got into the wrong car by mistake, and some people took him home, and by the time they saw my advertisement in the paper, he had run off, because they gave him a bubble bath, and then they couldn't find him." Joe had no way of knowing whether what Henry was saying was true or not. It sounded peculiar, that part about giving a dog a bubble bath. He certainly did not want to believe what he was hearing, not when it was beginning to look as if he might get to keep the dog. "Lots of dogs look like my dog," he said. "I don't think he's your dog at all." "Yes, he is," insisted Henry. "I know he is. I could tell by the picture in the paper." "Prove it," challenged Joe. "He always shakes hands with his left paw," said Henry. Mr. Sailor did not like to listen to people talk on the telephone. "What does the boy want?" he asked, interrupted conversation. "Some kid thinks my dog is his," answered Joe. "Says the dog shakes hands with his left paw." Mr. Sailor laughed. "Tell him you haven't been introduced," he said, and returned to his paper. "The dog and I haven't been introduced," said Joe to Henry. "We never shook hands." "But perhaps the dog does belong to the boy," protested Mrs. Sailor. "Let Junior handle it," said Mr. Sailor. There was a silence from Henry's end of the line. Joe had a feeling Henry wanted to say something like, "Oh, a wise guy." Joe looked down the hall at Ribsy lying on the carpet and said, "Okay, well, if he's your dog, why doesn't he have a license tag?" "He does have," said Henry, "but when he got lost, he wasn't wearing his collar. I took it off so he could scratch his neck." Joe felt triumphant. He was still carrying a red rhinestone-studded collar in his pocket. But this dog was wearing a collar when I found him. He realized too late that he had given away 2 bits of information. The dog had no license tag, and Joe had found him. "He's been gone about a month," said Henry. "Somebody else must have put a collar on him." "You still proved he is your dog," said Joe. Even though he had given out more information than he intended, he felt he had an advantage in the conversation. He could always hang up if he wanted to. "My dad says he'll drive me over to your house," said Henry. "You'll see. Ribsy knows me." "Ribsy?" said Joe. "That's a dumb name for a dog." At the sound of his name, Ribsy pricked up his ears. He had not heard the word Ribsy for weeks. "When I first got him, he was so thin his ribs showed," explained Henry, "so I called him Ribsy." "Well, they don't show now," said Joe. "It can't be the same dog." "Well, so long." "Wait!" The boy on the other end of the line sounded desperate. "My dad said he'd bring me over tonight. We're offering a reward for Ribsy." "How much?" Joe felt it could not be much. Ribsy was no fancy poodle or German shepherd. He was just a mutt. $10. $10? 10 whole dollars? $10 was worth a lot of money to Joe, but he was not going to admit it to Henry, who, He decided must have lots of money if he could offer a $10 reward for a dog when he could get another one just as good for free at the Humane Society. Much like Ribsy didn't cost anything. Joe's silence must have worried Henry because he raised the reward. $10 and my new flashlight. Can we come over now? Joe saw that he was gaining a new kind of advantage. After all, he could get another dog just as good as this one free of charge himself. If he stalled long enough, there was no telling what this boy might offer him. I don't know, he said, not committing himself. We're pretty busy. Anyway, I don't think he is your dog. He's happy here. I know he's my dog. Henry sounded worried. Then he seemed to have an idea. Hey, I know. Let me talk to him. This took Joe by surprise. On the phone? Sure, said Henry, sounding as if he talked to dogs on the telephone all the time. Joe was scornful of this suggestion. He did not believe a dog would pay any attention to a voice on a telephone, so he did not mind letting the boy try. Just a minute, he said. Ribsy heard Joe's fingers snapping for him to come. Obediently, he got up and trotted into the hall. Here, somebody wants to talk to you, said Joe, holding a telephone to Ribsy's ear. Hiya, Ribsy! Henry's voice came clearly through the telephone so that Joe could hear, too. How's Ribsy? It worked. Ribsy began to bark. Ribsy! Henry was shouting. Ribsy, it is you! Well, what do you know, thought Joe. A dog would talk on a telephone. Ribsy barked harder. He could not understand where Henry could be, but he recognized the voice coming out of the black thing Joe was holding to his ear. Maybe if he barked hard enough, Henry would come out from wherever he was hiding. Ribs! Henry shouted again. Ribsy! Joe, who was now sure of a reward, felt that a conversation that consisted of barks and a dog's name yelled into a telephone was not getting anyplace. Ribsy's nose told him that Henry was not in the living room or even that house, and so, as Joe put the telephone back against his own ear, he ran to the front door. When it was not open instantly, he began to bark wildly and scratch at the wood. Henry had to be someplace on the other side. The startled sailors stared at him until Darlene darted across the room and opened the door. Still barking, Ribsy ran out into the night. Ribsy! The boy's voice came faintly from the telephone in the hall. Ribsy, what happened to you? Back on the sailor's porch, Ribsy heard Joe shouting to his sister. What did you let him go for? There's a reward for him, $10 whole. And Darlene answered, when a dog wants out, you're supposed to let him go. How was I to know he was worth so much? Then Joe's feet came pounding down the sidewalk behind Ribsy. Ribsy! He called. Ribsy, come back here! But Ribsy wasn't coming back. Henry was somewhere close by, and he was going to find him. And that's the end of the chapter. So, Ribsy being a dog, he can hear Henry's voice and he can bark because he recognizes it. He doesn't understand how phones work, that the person could be miles and miles and miles away. But Ribsy, hearing that voice, got excited, and now he's off and running again. Henry was that close to having him back, and Joe was that close to getting a $10 reward. So, now that Ribsy's run off again, and Henry had an idea of where he is, we'll have to see if Henry is able to relocate him again. Because the next chapter, the last chapter, is called Ribsy and the Apartment House. So we'll see what happens there tomorrow. All right, catch you later.